The air inside the gym smelled of sweat and determination. The sound of gloves hitting pads echoed from one corner, while the rhythmic thud of feet against the mats came from another. Sundar Pichai stood quietly near the entrance, his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room. He wasn't here to train, not exactly. He was here for a meeting with the owner about a community project, but something in the energy of the place pulled him in. The gym was famous for training fighters, people who had titles, medals, and reputations that could intimidate anyone. Sundar, in his simple polo shirt and worn sneakers, didn't look like he belonged. Some people noticed him but didn't recognize him. They just saw a slim man with a calm face, walking slowly, observing everything. In the far corner, a group of young fighters were laughing about something. One of them, a tall man with a black belt tied around his waist, glanced over at Sundar. His grin widened. "Hey you," he called out, his voice loud enough to grab everyone's attention. "You here to join a class or just watch?" Sundar smiled politely. "Just watching," he replied softly. But the black belt wasn't done. "Come on, man. We're short on sparring partners. Step on the mat." His tone was teasing, but his eyes had a glint of challenge. Others around chuckled. A few fighters paused their training to watch. The black belt, whose name was Darren, was known for playing jokes on newcomers. Sometimes harmless, sometimes not. "I'm really not here to..." Sundar began, but Darren cut him off. "What's wrong?" "Scared? It's just light sparring," he said with a smirk, throwing a few playful jabs in the air. The room's attention shifted entirely to them. It was the kind of moment where you could feel tension building, like a rope being pulled tighter with each passing second. Sundar could feel eyes on him, waiting to see if he would back down. He thought about just refusing and walking away, but something in him hesitated. It wasn't pride. It was something else, an instinct that told him this was about more than just a joke. "All right," Sundar said quietly, "but only if we keep it respectful." The smirk on Darren's face deepened. "Of course," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. The coach, a broad-shouldered man with a beard, raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this?" he asked Sundar. "Yes," Sundar replied simply. Minutes later, Sundar stood barefoot on the mat, wearing borrowed gloves. He moved with an ease that surprised the people watching. He wasn't bouncing like a fighter, but there was a quiet steadiness in his stance. The bell rang. Darren moved in fast, testing Sundar with light punches. Sundar stepped aside smoothly, not flinching. Darren increased the pressure, his strikes sharper. But Sundar's eyes stayed calm, tracking every move. Whispers started in the crowd. "He's not bad," someone murmured. Then, in a sudden blur, Sundar countered. His movement was so precise that it stopped Darren in his tracks. It wasn't violent, it was controlled, efficient, and almost graceful. The black belt's smirk faded. He tried again, this time faster, but Sundar was already moving before the punch came. It was as if he could read Darren's intentions before they happened. "What's going on?" another fighter whispered. "Who is this guy?" The round ended with no clear winner, but the silence in the gym was louder than any applause. Darren pulled off his gloves, breathing hard. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice more respectful now. Sundar simply smiled. "Long story," he replied. But the truth was, this was only the beginning of the story. What no one knew was that Sundar's connection to Marshall. Arts went far deeper than a few moves on the mat, and that connection was about to change everything in this gym, and in the lives of the people inside it. The coach stepped forward, curiosity in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said to Sundar. And just like that, what began as a joke was about to turn into something no one in the gym would forget. The gym's noise slowly returned after this sparring match. But it wasn't quite the same as before. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an undercurrent of curiosity that clung to every glance cast in Sundar's direction. The fighters who had been laughing moments ago were now exchanging quiet whispers, their eyes darting between Sundar and Darren as if trying to make sense of what they had just seen. Darren, still catching his breath, walked over to the bench where his water bottle sat. He took a long drink, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and gave Sundar a long, thoughtful look. It wasn't a smirk from earlier, this time it was something closer to intrigue. The coach, whose name Sundar would later learn was Marco, motioned for him to step aside toward a quieter corner of the gym. Marco's steps were slow, deliberate, his eyes scanning Sundar, the way a veteran fighter sizes up an opponent, not for intimidation, but for understanding. "So," Marco began, his voice deep and steady, "where did you pick that up? You don't move like a beginner. And you don't move like someone who just watched a few YouTube tutorials, either." Sundar smiled faintly. "I practiced a bit when I was younger. Nothing formal for a long time." Marco tilted his head, unconvinced. "A bit?" "You read his footwork before he even shifted his weight. That takes years of drilling." The truth was, Sundar had trained in martial arts during his school years, not for competition, but as a way to find discipline and balance when life felt chaotic. His instructor back then had been a quiet, patient man who believed fighting was less about winning and more about controlling one's own mind. But Sundar had never spoken much about that part of his life. It wasn't something he flaunted. It was a private chapter, one he had tucked away as his career and responsibilities grew. "It's just muscle memory," Sundar finally replied, though he knew it was only part of the truth. Before Marco could say more, Darren approached, his black belt still tied around his waist, his expression unreadable. The fighters nearby leaned in subtly, pretending to busy themselves while listening. "Hey," Darren began, his tone softer than before. "You were good, better than I expected. I was just messing with you at first, didn't think you'd actually get in there." Sundar shrugged lightly. Sometimes it's worth stepping into something unexpected. Darren chuckled under his breath, though it sounded a little uneasy. "Oh, you've got timing and control. You could have tagged me a few times, but you didn't." "Because it wasn't about that," Sundar said simply. That response seemed to hang in the air longer than should have. A few of the younger fighters exchanged puzzled looks. They were used to sparring being about dominance, proving who was better, winning points, even if it was just practice. The idea that someone could step into the ring without that goal in mind was strange to them. Marco crossed his arms. "You free tomorrow evening?" Sundar hesitated. "Why?" "There's a kids' class. Some of them. They need more than just someone to hold pads for them. They need someone who can teach control, discipline. You might be what they need?" Sundar considered it for a moment. His schedule was already tight, and this wasn't part of his plan. But he could hear something in Marco's tone that wasn't just about filling an instructor gap. There was a sincerity there, a quiet urgency. Before he could answer, the sound of raised voices came from the far side of the gym. Two teenage boys, both in their early teens, were squared off near the lockers. One had shoved the other against the wall, and the taller one's fists were clenched. "You think you're better than me?" The taller boy snarled, "Knock it off." Marco barked, starting toward them, but Sundar was already moving. He didn't rush. He walked quickly, but with a calm presence that seemed to cut through the tension. The boys froze for a split second when they noticed him approaching. "What's going on?" Sundar asked quietly, his voice level but firm. The taller boy glanced away. "Nothing." "Didn't look like nothing," Sundar replied, his eyes steady on the boys. "You want to talk about it?" The other boy, smaller and breathing hard, shook his head. "It's fine." But Sundar could read it in their faces. Pride, frustration, insecurity, all tangled together. He recognized it because he had seen it before in himself and in countless others over the years. "Listen," Sundar said, addressing both of them. "If you want to prove something, prove it to yourself. Not like this. The mat is for learning, not hurting." His words weren't loud, but the way he said them carried weight. The boys exchanged a glance, and after a moment, the taller one muttered, "Sorry," before stepping back. Marco arrived, giving Sundar a look that was part surprise, part approval. "You see what I mean?" he said quietly. "You've got something these kids listen to. That's rare." And that was when Sundar realized this wasn't just about a sparring match anymore. Something had shifted in the gym's dynamic the moment he stepped onto the mat. Now, Whether he wanted it or not, he was becoming part of it. He still didn't know the full story behind this place, behind the people training here, or why Marco had looked at him like he was the answer to a question that hadn't been spoken yet. But he was about to find out, and the truth would pull him deeper into a challenge, far greater than just stepping onto a mat with a black belt. Asterisk the next evening. Sundar returned to the gym. He had almost talked himself out of it earlier in the day, telling himself he had too many calls, too many deadlines, too much on his plate. But every time he remembered the look in Marco's eyes, and the way those two boys yesterday had stopped mid-fight to listen to him, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Asterisk. The sun was beginning to set when he stepped inside. The gym felt different at this hour. Instead of the grunts and heavy strikes of adult fighters, there was a lighter energy, small sneakers squeaking on the mats, laughter mixed with nervous chatter. The kids' class had begun. Marco stood in the center, surrounded by about a dozen children, their ages ranging from 7 to 15. Some wore crisp white geese. Others were in old t-shirts and shorts. Their belts were a mix of colors, from bright yellow to faded orange. As Sundar entered, a few of the kids glanced at him curiously. One whispered to another, and they both giggled. Marco waved him over. "Glad you came," he said, with a grin. Before Sundar could reply, a boy at the back of the group shouted, "That's the guy who fought Darren yesterday." A ripple of excitement ran through the class. Marco chuckled under his breath. "Well, looks like your reputation got here before you did." Sundar smiled faintly, but stayed quiet, choosing instead to watch the warm-up drills. He noticed small things, how one boy kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone who never came. How another girl's movements were sharp and aggressive, as though she was fighting someone in her head instead of just practicing. When the warm-ups ended, Marco clapped his hands. "All right, everyone, pair up. We're doing control drills today. But first, I want you to meet someone. This is Sundar. Yesterday, he stepped on the mat with one of our best fighters. And while I'm not going to say who got the better of who," he paused with a sly smile. "What I will say is, Sundar showed something more important than strength. He showed control." The kids looked at Sundar with a mix of awe and curiosity. Marco continued, "And control in here matters more than winning." He gestured for Sundar to step forward. "Why don't you talk to them for a minute?" Sundar took a slow breath. He wasn't used to giving speeches to kids he just met, but there was something about their eager eyes that made him want to get it right. "When I was your age," he began, "I thought fighting was about proving I was stronger than someone else. But then I met a teacher who told me something I've never forgotten. He said, the best fighter is the one who never has to throw a punch." A few of the kids frowned, as if trying to work out how that could make sense. "It means," Sundar explained, "that if you have the skill to defend yourself, you also have the responsibility to choose when not to fight. Strength isn't just in your arms or legs, it's in your decisions." The girl who had been moving aggressively earlier raised her hand. "But what if someone hits you first?" Sundar nodded. "Then you defend yourself. But even then, your goal isn't to destroy them. Your goal is to protect yourself and end the fight as quickly as possible. Real strength is knowing you could hurt someone and choosing not to unless you truly have no other choice." Marco gave him a subtle nod of approval. The class continued, with Sundar helping to guide the drills. He was careful with his words, giving feedback in a way that encouraged rather than embarrassed. When a boy kept fumbling his footwork, Sundar knelt down beside him and broke the movement into smaller steps until the boy finally got it right. The smile that spread across the boy's face was worth more than any trophy. But as the class went on, Sundar noticed something unusual. Darren had arrived and was standing quietly in the doorway, watching. He wasn't in training gear, just jeans and a hoodie, hands in his pockets. His expression was unreadable. When the class ended and the kids left in groups of chattering energy, Darren stayed behind. Sundar could feel his presence even as he was picking up stray pads and belts left on the mat. Finally, Darren stepped forward. "You're good with them?" he said, his voice low. "Thanks." Sundar replied, "Listen, Darren hesitated, glancing toward the floor. About yesterday. I wasn't just messing with you for fun. I mean, yeah, it started that way. But I've had this thing in my head lately. I've been stuck. Training feels empty. Fights feel empty. I thought maybe embarrassing some random guy would make me feel something. But instead, he trailed off, shaking his head. Instead, you just made me curious. Sundar looked at him closely. Curious about what? About why someone like you, someone who's clearly not here for ego, moves the way you do. You don't fight like you're trying to win. You fight like you're searching for something. For a moment, the gym was quiet except for the faint hum of the lights overhead. Sundar could feel there was more behind Darren's words, something he wasn't saying yet. Before he could ask, Marco called from across the room. Darren, you coming to the meet on Saturday? Darren's jaw tightened. I don't know yet. He called back. Then, to Sundar, he added, you should come too. It's not just a meet. You'll see. He turned and walked out. Without another word, Marco walked over, scratching his beard. That meet he's talking about, it's more than a competition. It's complicated. You'll understand when you get there. And though Sundar didn't yet know what complicated meant, he could feel it in the way both men spoke. There was a story here, one that went deeper than the gym floor, and something told him that Saturday's event was going to change. The way he saw all of them. Especially Darren. Astrous Saturday arrived with a sky that seemed undecided patches of pale blue streaked between slow-moving clouds. The kind that hinted at rain but didn't commit. Sundar stood outside the gym, a faint chill in the air brushing against his skin. The parking lot was fuller than usual, cars lined up in uneven rows, people milling about with gym bags slung over their shoulders. Some looked excited, others. Kent Marco spotted him from the entrance and waved him over. Glad you made it, he said, patting Sundar on the back. Come inside, we've got a lot to do before things start. As soon as Sundar stepped through the door, he realized this wasn't a normal fight meet. The gym had been transformed, extra chairs set up along the walls, a small set of bleachers at the far end, and a raised mat area surrounded by temporary ropes. Banners with motivational quotes hung above, though some were faded with age. There was a buzz in the air, a mixture of anticipation and something heavier. Sundar caught fragments of conversation talk about last year's incident, about the sponsors watching closely, and about someone named Tyson who was back and looking for blood. Marco led him toward the office, where a table was covered in registration sheets, water bottles, and clipboards. This isn't just about fighting, Marco said in a lower voice, leaning closer. Every year, we host this invitational for local fighters. It's a chance for up-and-comers to prove themselves, maybe get noticed by bigger gyms or event organizers. But there's more to it than that. For a lot of these kids, it's a lifeline. Winning here can mean getting a scholarship to train, finding a mentor, even getting out of bad situations. Sundar listened, his gaze drifting back toward the floor, where fighters were already stretching. He recognized a few from the kids' class earlier in the week, but most were older late teens, early 20s. Their eyes sharp with focus. Marco continued. Darren used to be the star of this meet. 3 years running, no one could touch him. But then things happened. He lost in the finals 2 years ago, and it hit him harder than anyone expected. He hasn't been the same since. What happened? Sundar asked. Marco hesitated. He didn't just lose. He lost to Tyson. They grew up training together, but Tyson went down a different path. Started fighting dirty, both inside and outside the ring. The loss wasn't clean, but it still counted. Darren's been carrying it ever since. Before Sundar could respond, a sudden roar of laughter came from the far side of the gym. A tall, broad-shouldered man was standing there, flanked by two others. His presence filled the space, not just because of his size, but because of the way people seemed to part for him without being asked. Sundar didn't need to be told. This was Tyson. Tyson, single quotes, as eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Darren, who was in the corner wrapping his hands. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. He called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, Karen, ready for round two? Or are you planning to quit early this time?" The room went still for a moment. Darren didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, and he kept his focus on the tape around his wrists. Marco muttered under his breath, "That's why I wanted you here. It's not just about fighting skills, it's about keeping this from boiling." Over the next hour, Sundar moved between helping set up equipment and quietly observing the fighters. He noticed the way Tyson's group carried themselves, loud, confident, almost predatory. In contrast, Darren stayed quiet, stretching and warming up with slow, deliberate movements. But there was a tension in his shoulders, a heaviness in the way he exhaled between sets. The matches began, one after another. The crowd cheered, the sound of gloves meeting pads and bodies hitting the mat filling the air. Sundar found himself drawn to the intensity, to the way each fight seemed to tell its own story, some about confidence, others about desperation. When it was nearly Darren's turn, Marco approached Sundar again. "Listen, I'm not asking you to step in and fight, but if things start to get ugly, I might need you to help keep it under control." "Tyson likes to push boundaries." Sundar nodded slowly. "Understood." As Darren stepped into the ring, the room seemed to shrink. Tyson was waiting for him, his grin wider now, eyes gleaming with something more than competition. The referee gave instructions, but Sundar could already tell Tyson wasn't listening. He was watching Darren like a predator watches prey. The bell rang. Tyson came in hard, throwing aggressive combinations that forced Darren backward. But Darren stayed composed, blocking, dodging, looking for openings. The crowd roared with each exchange, the energy pulsing through the gym. Then, halfway through the first round, Tyson did something subtle. An elbow flicked just a little too high during a clinch, catching Darren near the temple. It wasn't enough to cause serious damage, but it was deliberate. Hidden from the referee's angle, Marco cursed under his breath. Sundar's eyes narrowed. He could see exactly what Tyson was doing, masking dirty moves inside legitimate ones. Eroding Darren's focus. By the second round, Darren's breathing had grown heavier, his guard dropping just slightly. Tyson pressed the advantage, landing a body shot that echoed in the room. The crowd was shouting now, some urging Darren on, others calling for Tyson to finish it. Sundar could feel the air thickening, the fight teetering on the edge of something. Dangerous. And then, in a flash, Tyson's next move crossed the line, a knee that looked like it was aimed at the midsection, but came dangerously close to Darren's face. Sundar was on his feet before he realized it, his heart pounding. And that was when he saw it, Darren's eyes locking on Tyson's, a flicker of something deep and raw flashing there. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a decision. What happened in the next few seconds would decide not just the match, but the future of both fighters, and Sundar knew in his gut that he might have to step in before it was too late. The knee came up too fast for most eyes to follow, and for a fraction of a second, time seemed to slow. Sundar could see every detail, the tightening of Tyson's shoulders, the calculated shift of his hips, the smirk that broke across his face just before the impact. Darren twisted just in time, the strike glancing past his cheek instead of smashing into it, but the crowd reacted in a sudden burst of shouts and angry calls. The referee stepped forward, barking a warning, but Tyson just shrugged, his hands lifted in mock innocence. "Wasn't intentional," he said, the grin never leaving his face. Darren's jaw clenched so tight that Sundar could see the muscles moving from where he stood. It wasn't just pain or even frustration, there was a different kind of weight behind his expression, the kind that came from years of history between two people. Marco muttered, "This is getting dangerous." He glanced at Sundar, his eyes sharp. "Be ready." The bell rang for the next round. As they squared off again, Tyson's attacks grew more aggressive, each strike carrying just enough extra force to blur the line between fair and foul. Darren absorbed them with gritted teeth. But Sundar could tell his composure was cracking. In the third exchange, Tyson landed a clean hook to Darren's ribs, followed by a shove that sent him stumbling against the ropes. The crowd roared in approval. But Sundar noticed something in Darren's body language, his shoulders slumping for just a heartbeat, his gaze dropping. That was when Tyson leaned in, speaking too low for the referee to hear but loud enough for Sundar, who was closer now to catch a few words, same as last time. "You'll never beat me. You were nothing then, and you're nothing now." Something in Darren snapped. He came forward with a flurry of punches, fast, desperate, and powerful. The crowd erupted, some cheering wildly, others gasping as the momentum shifted. Tyson was caught off guard at first, blocking and retreating, but then his smile returned. He wanted this. He thrived on chaos. And in the chaos, another foul came, this one, blatant. A headbutt in the clinch, sharp and deliberate. Darren staggered back, blood trickling from a cut near his brow. Marco was already moving toward the ring. But Sundar's instincts kicked in before he even thought about it. He slipped past a few onlookers, stepping up to the edge of the mat just as the referee turned to check the cut. Tyson, seeing the brief distraction, moved in for a finishing shot, a crushing hook that could end the fight in an instant. Without thinking, Sundar's voice cut through the noise, low but commanding. "Darren, breathe." It was strange, almost absurd that such a simple instruction could pierce the chaos. But it did. Darren's eyes flicked toward Sundar for just a second, and in that moment, something shifted. The wildness in his movements cooled. His breathing steadied. He reset his stance. Tyson smirked again, clearly thinking he still had the upper hand. "You got a coach now, huh?" He taunted, but Sundar didn't flinch. He met Tyson's stare calmly, and for the briefest moment, there was an unspoken exchange, one fighter recognizing another. The referee let the fight resume. But as Tyson came in with another aggressive rush, Darren didn't meet him with panic. This time, he stepped to the side, deflecting the strike with precision instead of force. The crowd noticed the difference immediately. His movements were cleaner, more deliberate, almost eerily similar to the way Sundar had sparred with him. Days earlier, Tyson grew frustrated, his punches missing their mark. Then, in a sudden lunge, he overextended, leaving his balance open. Darren capitalized, sweeping his leg and sending Tyson crashing to the mat. The crowd exploded in noise. But Sundar wasn't celebrating yet. Tyson was too proud to stay down. He pushed himself up, breathing hard, his grin gone now, replaced by something darker. As they circled each other again, Sundar caught a flash of recognition in Tyson's eyes, like he had finally figured out who Sundar was. Tyson's gaze flicked between Darren and Sundar, his jaw tightening. "So that's where you learned it," he said, under his breath. Just loud enough for Sundar to hear. Marco, standing at the opposite side of the ring, noticed the look and frowned. "What's he talking about?" But Sundar didn't answer. His mind was already racing, old memories pushing to the surface. Memories of a younger version of himself, training under the same roof where Tyson once fought as a teenager long before Tyson had gone down a different path. Whatever this fight had started as, Sundar now realized it wasn't just Darren's battle. It was his too. And the history between him and Tyson was about to come out. Whether he wanted it to or not. The round ended. But the tension in the room didn't. The crowd's energy was electric, waiting for the final round. Marco stepped close to Sundar, his voice low but firm. "If you know something about this, now's the time to tell me." Sundar glanced at the fighters, at the crowd, at the expectant faces all around. "After this round," he said quietly, "because in just a few minutes, the truth and the fight would come to a head." The bell rang for the final round, and the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, like the moment before a storm. Breaks? The gym was packed with noise-stomping feet, shouts from the crowd, the hollow thump of gloves against forearms, but Sundar's focus narrowed. Every detail stood out. The way Darren rolled his shoulders to shake off the fatigue, the twitch at the corner of Tyson's mouth that revealed both anticipation and a dangerous edge. The taut stillness in Marco's stance at ringside. Tyson came forward first, his steps heavy, his guard high. But his eyes weren't just on Darren anymore. They kept darting towards Sundar. A subtle acknowledgement that this fight was no longer just between the two men inside the ropes. There was history bleeding into the present, and it was starting to show. Darren's movements were sharper now, stripped of the desperation that had nearly cost him earlier. He kept his distance, using measured jabs and quick sidesteps, forcing Tyson to chase instead of dictate. The crowd responded with a low hum of approval, sensing the momentum shift. But Tyson wasn't going to let this turn into a chess match. He thrived on chaos, and chaos was what he intended to bring halfway into the round. Tyson feinted left and drove in with a heavy right hook. Darren blocked, but the impact still rattled through his frame, sending him back a step. Tyson pressed in close, muttering something through clenched teeth that Sundar couldn't fully hear. But he caught the last word, again, Sundar's. Chest tightened. The word was a trigger from their shared past, a cruel tactic meant to break focus. Years ago, when Sundar was younger, he had trained in the same circles as Tyson, back when Tyson was just a hungry kid with raw talent and a dangerous temper. There had been a sparring match, a brutal one, where Tyson had gone too far and injured a promising fighter Sundar's own mentor's son. Again, had been what Tyson said back then. After every cheap shot, daring someone to stop him. Darren didn't know the history, but Sundar saw the confusion flicker in his eyes. Don't chase him, Sundar called out from the sidelines, his voice steady but carrying enough force to cut through the noise. Make him come to you. Tyson's grin faltered. He recognized the authority in Sundar's tone, the same voice that, years ago, had been the only one in the room willing to tell him no. The next exchange happened fast. Tyson lunged, aiming to trap Darren in the corner, but Darren pivoted out, landing a clean body shot on the way. The crowd erupted, and for the first time all match, Tyson's frustration was visible. He swung harder, faster, but the precision was gone. Each miss fed the tension in his movements, and each successful counter from Darren chipped away at his confidence. Asterisk. The seconds bled away, and with less than a minute to go, Tyson tried one last gamble, a risky overhand right that left his side completely exposed. Darren didn't hesitate. He stepped in, his strike finding its mark with perfect timing, sending Tyson stumbling backward into the ropes. The referee jumped in, assessing the situation, but Tyson waved him off, wanting to keep going. His pride wouldn't let him quit. And then, in that brief pause, Tyson's eyes locked with Sundar's. It wasn't anger now, it was something heavier. Recognition. You should have stayed gone, Tyson said quietly, just for Sundar to hear. Sundar stepped closer to the edge of the mat, his gaze steady. And you should have learned. The bell rang, ending the match. The sound unleashed the crowd into cheers, applause, and scattered shouts. The referee raised Darren's hand, declaring him the winner. Darren's face broke into a relieved smile, but it was tempered with exhaustion. Tyson stayed for a moment, before finally nodding, a grudging acknowledgement. When he stepped out of the ring, he walked past Sundar without speaking. But the slight dip of his head was its own kind of truce, a silent admission that the lesson had landed. Even if his pride wouldn't let him say it aloud. Marco clapped Darren on the shoulder, grinning wide. You did it. You kept your head and you fought smart. Darren turned to Sundar, his voice low. Thanks. I don't think I would have pulled it together without you. Sundar shook his head. You did the work. I just reminded you of what you already had. As the gym began to empty, the noise fading into the cool evening outside, Sundar lingered near the ropes. He wasn't sure if he would come back tomorrow or if this chapter was already closing. But as he watched Darren laughing with a couple of the younger fighters and saw the way the kids from earlier in the week looked at him with something close to admiration, he felt that this wasn't just about one fight or one win. It was about changing the way people understood strength. And somewhere deep down, Sundar knew that even if Tyson never said the words, the silence that had fallen between them after the match was proof enough. Sometimes the loudest victories are the ones that don't need to be announced. The night ended with the faint hum of the gym lights and the quiet thud of someone still hitting pads in the far corner. Outside, the air smelled like rain, and Sundar walked into it with a calm he hadn't felt in years. He had come here for a meeting. Instead, he had found a fight worth stepping into and left with more than just a win. He had left a mark,